Welcome to our session, Other People's Platforms, Defeating Online Fraud Outside Your Virtual Jurisdiction. I'm Sam Small, and I'm the Chief Security Officer at ZeroFox, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to chat with you here today. In 2011, Mark Andreessen of the venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz published an essay titled, How Software is Eating the World. In it, he highlights how more traditional business models were being challenged and defeated by new digital-first approaches. Uber was eating into the market share of traditional taxi companies, for instance. Airbnb was affecting the revenue of hotels, and websites like Priceline and Expedia were quickly putting travel agencies out of business. In the world of enterprise software, I'd argue that we've seen something even more specific, and that is that software as a service is eating the world. As you can see, the rate of growth in enterprise SaaS spending is tremendous across all business functions, and for good reason. SaaS applications allow businesses to quickly adopt best-in-class solutions without the burdens of hosting, deployment, or management, and concerns or issues involving uptime, updates, backups, or platform security are largely covered by the provider, not only relieving businesses from these responsibilities, but also reducing constraints on productivity. In looking briefly at the top SaaS applications by business function, it's likely you'll recognize many vendors used in your own organization. And more broadly, beyond just considering these enterprise use cases, SaaS platforms have heavily influenced consumer activity. This consumer activity influences business strategy in a number of ways, becoming a prominent aspect of driving engagement or awareness through social media campaigns, providing new channels for direct customer support, facilitating hiring and recruiting initiatives, or simply allowing us to gauge consumer sentiment and brand enthusiasm online. With all this in mind, you may wonder what any of this has to do with enterprise security or this session. Good. That's the right question to be asking. My intent is for you to now recognize that the swift and mass adoption of SaaS products and digital platforms has heavily impacted the enterprise risk landscape. In other words, digital engagement leads to digital risk. And with these changes, attackers are now able to plan, operate, and benefit from attacks that occur completely outside the realm of your corporate systems, beyond the visibility of conventional auditing, logging, and alerting capabilities within your enterprise. And it is these attacks that we classify under the umbrella category of digital threats and consider within the subject of digital risks. What exactly do these attacks entail? Let's review some of the hallmark categories. Impersonation threats include those where an attacker masquerades as a business and its brands or affiliated employees on digital platforms. In this category, we often see impersonations targeting more technical assets like domain names as well. Infrastructure threats include information and conversations about vulnerabilities, exploits, or access to the systems and infrastructure your business relies on, whether it be within your own core business systems or involves the many SaaS applications you use as well. Malicious links and files play a role here as well, and these can be just as dangerous, if not more so, to your employees or customers beyond the confines of your corporate systems. Scams and fraud run rampant on digital platforms, especially those targeting B2C businesses. Attackers will leverage interest and consumer confidence in your brand to entice users to engage in risky behavior, but these attacks will often target company employees as well. As the adoption of collaboration features within cloud platforms increase, it often becomes more difficult to prevent asset exposure. Accurately tracking and protecting the data we generate or leave behind on these platforms is a complex task because each platform has its own unique approach to access control. Permissions are notoriously easy to misconfigure, and even with our best behavior, system changes or new features can cause unintended consequences. These risks often fall hand in hand with compliance and regulation risks that organizations face as the complexity of the modern business ecosystem challenges our ability to identify violations and enforce adherence to policies and requirements across this diverse landscape. Finally, account takeovers on digital platforms or SaaS systems often catch security teams by surprise, and corporate data breaches and credentials are commonly dumped or sold in cybercrime forums like those found on the dark web. What's common among all these categories are activities that target businesses beyond their corporate systems and services in the cloud, and too often leave businesses scrambling when these events occur as they struggle to control the situation or minimize business. So some of you may be thinking to yourself, well, you're talking about digital risk protection, but a lot of this sounds like what I get out of my cyber threat intelligence data, or it seems like there's some overlap here with what I'm familiar with as cyber threat intelligence, and you're not wrong. Part of digital risk protection is cyber threat intelligence. And when I think of threat intelligence data, I think of it as almost a service layer for our other security stack investments, whether those be more traditional enterprise security products like antivirus or SOAR or SIEM, but also maybe for our ticketing system where here threat intelligence data can enrich and contextualize information we have in these other systems, and it can help make our analysts more efficient and help them to prioritize certain alerts or risks that we're seeing in these products. So that is super helpful, but there are some additional programmatic aspects that are important here. And that's why we have this distinction between digital risk protection and threat intelligence data. So threat intelligence data, again, is a very specific component and aspect of a digital risk protection strategy. And digital risk protection is a program capability, much like other traditional program capabilities, such as AppSec or logging or auditing or authorization, and all of those other kind of bedrock pieces of a good security program. Now that you better understand what we mean by digital threats and better understand the space of digital risk protection, let's take a look at some examples. This is what the customer portal login looks like for Acme Bank, a fictional institution that I've created just for the purposes of this presentation. However, this is not Acme Bank's actual website, acmebank.com. Instead, it is acmebank.us, a domain purchased by an attacker who is now hosting a replica of the bank's login page on this site. The attacker will use this site in phishing attacks to harvest user credentials and access customer accounts. Even worse, if any victims have reused their credentials elsewhere on the web, the attacker will likely access those systems as well. And why do we consider this a digital threat? Because all of the indicators of this particular attack, from the initial registration of the domain, the hosting of the phishing site, its promotion across various digital channels, and its use by legitimate customers of the bank, all occur outside the scope of the bank's traditional enterprise security tools. It's only through cyber threat intelligence data and our digital risk protection program that we're able to identify the early indicators of this behavior and consider our mitigation and remediation options. Here's another example that's even easier and cheaper to launch. A business page impersonating Acme Bank on LinkedIn. It doesn't cost anything to create a new account and choose whatever business name and logo images we like. We can make ourselves look even more legitimate by having compromised or bot accounts follow us, giving visitors the impression that this is a legitimate source of information and customer support for the business. The behavior highlighted by this example is often used by attackers to promote phishing websites like we saw in the previous example, pursue HR and recruitment scams, or to phish employees and customers further via direct messaging. Returning back to this domain purchased by our attacker to impersonate Acme Bank, we see another attack that is far too common. In this case, an email coming from our attacker isn't attempting to phish the user, but instead expects that the recipient will recognize the name of a coworker without noticing the similar but illegitimate domain name. This is a classic example of business email compromise that can target either employees or customers or vendors or partners, imploring them to complete the attack for them by fooling them into performing an activity under false pretense. In this case, that would be changing the account details for an employee's direct deposit. In this example, we see a post made by an attacker on a dark web forum advertising the sale of Acme Bank customer account data. Monitoring for this type of activity is important because early identification can help to prevent loss by the bank and its customers, and may also help to pinpoint active vulnerabilities and the source of the breached data and which systems were exploited to access that data. In this final example, we see a customer venting their frustration about a recent experience with the bank, and then an all too friendly customer service representative is eager to help address that customer's problems. Unfortunately, in this case, the support account is not legitimate, and if selected, the link shared by the attacker will likely lead to phishing, account compromise, malware, or ransomware. Unfortunately, I don't have time in this presentation to talk about how to find all of these types of examples that may target your organization in an efficient, proactive, or automatic manner as one would do as part of a mature DRP program. That's a conversation we can have offline, or we can talk more about how ZeroFox does those things. But what I would like to do is to talk about what organizations typically face when they do find evidence of these activities. And if you're not familiar with dealing with these types of threats and it's not part of your normal day job, you might think that the first thing you do is send an email to the platform. And in fact, sometimes that's the only option you have, depending on what options the platforms themselves make available. So in this particular case, I'll pretend to be Pat from Acme Bank, our VP of Cyber Risk, and send an email to the platform stating that I found some bad things and I attached some details to prove that they are bad things and that the people involved do not represent my organization. So will you please take these things down? And any reasonable organization, we'd hope, would hopefully respond and do so. In other situations, platforms have dealt with this issue so often that they might have a form that you fill out instead, because there's so many of these types of threats that they have different teams focused on different threats depending on the attributes or the particulars of the threat itself. So in this case, what I did here is I copied a form wholesale from a platform that has one of these survey forms, but I removed any of the identifying information to keep it generic for our purposes here. And these are two of the most common ways you'll interact with a platform when you try to have something removed. Unfortunately, not a lot of platforms have APIs where you can submit takedown requests along with the artifacts that demonstrate where there's been a violation of a terms of service clause or where a law has been broken, etc. So when you send in these kind of reports, you tend to receive responses that fit in one of a few categorical types over and over again. So what I thought would be fun here would be to briefly show examples from a number of categories we've typically seen in the past when we've sent takedown requests on behalf of our customers. The first type of response I'll share with you, I call the nothing to see here response, where even though you've provided exact details and artifacts to prove your point, and maybe even pointed out the exact line in the terms of service or EULA where there's been a violation by a bad actor, the platform is refusing to engage with you or admit that they see something bad has taken place. And that's not a great place to be. It's probably going to require a few more round trips on your behalf to get things moving with this provider. In this second example, we see that it's similar to the first, except here the platform provider discounts our report because we didn't properly categorize the request. So for instance here, the content may obviously be problematic, but we may have reported that the content is infringing upon intellectual property belonging to our company, where instead the platform representative wants us to classify the content as some other type of infraction. So ultimately it's a little bit like playing Simon Says, and until you get it right, they won't be able to help you. This next example blows my mind. Here we have a platform representative asking us to contact the bad actor directly and ask if they will remove the content in question, perhaps if we ask nicely. We know that's not a very likely outcome, and it's a strange deflection of responsibility. Ultimately, you can convince platform representatives to revisit these decisions, but while that's taking place, time is wasted and the impact of these threats continues to grow. Moving on to our next example, this is bound to stop anyone in their tracks who works in a security operations center. Your tier 1 or tier 2 analysts likely don't have any experience obtaining a court order, so this is probably going to have to be escalated to legal, which is going to take some time. And even worse, here's an example where the requirement is a little higher in that we have to obtain an Estonian court order. So in that area, I'm completely out of water, as maybe even your legal team would be as well. And finally, we have maybe the strangest response of all. Here we have a request for you to prove your identity as a counterpoint to the claim that you've made that someone is impersonating your identity or someone's identity at your organization by sending the platform a picture of you or the victim smiling while holding a picture of some form of government-issued identification. This is troublesome for a number of reasons. Obviously, as security professionals, we probably don't love the idea that we're sending a photo ID to another organization via email over the internet, where who knows what will happen to that data in transport or at rest. And even worse, is your tier 1 or tier 2 analyst expected to go to people in your C-suite to ask them to pose for a picture with their government ID so that you can send it to a platform when they're the victim of impersonation? That sounds like a difficult conversation to have. It sounds also like an inefficient process. And I think among all these answers, there's a real strangeness demonstrated by these responses. And it represents ultimately that there's still a lot of maturity that needs to take place in this area of digital threat remediation and mitigation. What I'd like to do now is briefly touch on some concepts around response strategy beyond just emailing or filling out forms. So I've broken this down into a few categories. The first is about target. What is our target? What is your target? Is your goal to remove a digital threat directly? It probably is initially, but sometimes you can take something down indirectly as well. We all know the internet is a multi-layered and complex entity. So while obviously, if I can take down someone's malicious website by going to the hosting provider, that's a great direct strategy. And once it's accomplished, the content is gone. But if I'm not able to do that, maybe the next best thing to do is to go to the domain registrar and convince them that there is a crime happening on that particular site and have them remove or revoke the domain records. Additionally, you can combine these sorts of things based on your intent. So if I think of indirectly mitigating an issue, what I might try to do in parallel to working directly with a hosting provider or domain registrar, I can submit a URL to a blacklist like fishtank or abuse.ch or to Google's safe browsing team. So even if someone does visit one of those fraudulent or malicious websites where we know bad things are happening, I can have the content added to any of those security products or security products that make use of those services to perhaps prevent a user from actually loading or viewing that content or those pages. So an example here would be, for instance, if you're a Google Chrome user, you may try to visit a website, but you'll often see that red warning screen in the browser blocking you from loading the page because it suspects the site may be malicious or fraudulent. So in this case, the site still exists. We haven't been able to remove it from the internet, but in the meantime, we've mitigated the risk quite a bit because the number of victims will be reduced dramatically. So I recommend organizations have a capability to do these things in parallel where possible. And then finally, think about who your actor is. I wouldn't expect my SOC analysts to have legal skills and intuition, but I also wouldn't expect my legal team to have the same capacity, capabilities, or velocity as my SOC team members in identifying and classifying or responding to digital threats. So the best strategy, probably if you're doing it yourself without a vendor or a service to help, is to have a collaborative relationship between the SOC and your legal team. So understand that remediation will move at the speed of the actor involved, and unfortunately, legal is often a slow, expensive apparatus at most organizations. And while when you get to the point where someone wants a court order, that might be a great time to bring in legal, and that's fine. Ultimately, I wouldn't ask my legal team to triage the hundreds of potential takedowns we might want to perform or request because they're just not tuned to deal with that type of work. To wrap up, I'd like to go over some brief points of advice. The first thing and the best thing you can do is put your house in order. If you don't plan for dealing with digital threats and issues on other people's platforms, you won't be able to respond to them successfully and efficiently. And that's why you need to gather as much relevant information as possible ahead of time. This includes the items listed here, but it also includes creating plans and understanding roles, responsibilities, and identities within your organization as it pertains to these matters. Likewise, I would suggest that you develop, share, and automate playbooks around what to do and how to do it. I'd also recommend that if you're trying to do this internally, that you don't try to automate everything from the get-go. My general rule of thumb is to do something once or twice manually, and if you find yourself doing it over and over again, then document the process and try to find ways to automate or optimize the process, especially the ones that have rote aspects to them. As we talked about earlier, it's important to establish a relationship with your legal department as well. It should be obvious why that's going to be necessary, but you want to have those bidirectional lines of communication established well in advance of facing or dealing with one of these events or an incident. Additionally, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's important to be persistent. Even if you've clearly outlined your case for support and it's ironclad, most platforms are going to respond best to the squeaky wheels. And finally, set expectations and make contingency plans with your team and your organization around you. The last thing you want is someone else in your organization to be upset with you or your team or your performance in how a takedown has played out because they didn't fully understand that the matters and response times were not completely within your organization's control. So by setting expectations around these different scenarios, you can try to ensure that you have everyone's support and patience in those times of crises. And with that, I'm nearly out of time, so I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I hope you were able to learn something new. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you'd like to learn more about any of the topics I discussed, or visit our virtual booth, website, or contact my other colleagues listed here if you'd like to learn more about how ZeroFox help organizations prevent, identify, and remediate digital threats better than anyone else. So thanks again, and have a wonderful day.